We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, upon our oaths, do find the defendant, Lori Daybell, as to the crime of count 1, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder occurring on or about July 11, 2019, guilty.
Well, you just heard the verdict. We begin tonight with breaking team coverage just hours after Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow.
We have 12 News journalists Erica Stapleton and Bianca Bono live outside the courthouse in downtown Phoenix. We're going to get started first with Erica.
Yeah, Caribe, Mark, it was really an impactful moment in the courtroom when that verdict came in. We were waiting all day and we expected we might get it this afternoon. And by the time we got in there and the jury was let in, it all happened really quickly. And I've described this as almost like a big holding of breath until that verdict was read, and then you could almost hear an exhale. When I say hear exhale, I think that's coming from the family members of Charles Vallow who have been in the courtroom, some of who testified during this trial. And to give you some backstory here, Lori Vallow Daybell has already been convicted of killing her children, Tylee and JJ, in Idaho. She was also convicted in her role in the death of her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife. So there's a huge backstory here. None of that came up in this case for the jury, but the people in the room, the people who are watching this, the media, the public, and the family members, they know this history and know what it means to be in this courtroom today and get another guilty verdict for Lori Vallow Daybell. And I want to point out two family members in particular. That would be Charles Vallow's sister, Kay Woodcock, and his brother, Jerry Vallow. And, you know, I can't imagine being in their shoes, having to go through trial after trial. 2 trials in Idaho, one for Lori Vallow, one for her husband, Chad Daybell. And now they're here 6 years after Charles Vallow was killed in Chandler. And you know, they said there was some relief. They said it feels good to get this guilty verdict, but of course it doesn't bring Charles back. This whole case has been disturbing with dead spouses, dead children, a whole conspiracy beyond this. So Lori Vallow Daybell could be with Chad Daybell. And, you know, there was dark religious beliefs at the core of this case. So it's really a lot to take in. And again, to finally get to this moment, I think was some justice for Charles Vallow's family. I was able to ask his siblings, you know, what would you say to Lori if you could talk to her right now? And here's how they responded.
We got you, and you're not the smartest person in the room, and now it's time for you just to hide away. And well, after Brandon's trial, but you can just hide away and everybody's going to forget about you. We'll be on our way through our life, and she'll be rotting in prison where she deserves to be.
And like Charles always used to say, love always wins.
You know, Kay also described the past several years like walking through the pits of hell. Again, it's hard to imagine what this family has gone through, losing so many family members and also having to have this day in court over and over again. I'll mention that Lori Vallow Daybell represented herself in this case. That's something we did not see in Idaho. And, you know, I think the reaction was mixed. Clearly, the jury did not buy what she was selling. And we saw different versions of her in the courtroom. We saw her getting tense when she was cross-examining people. We saw her kind of being more soft-spoken with a softer voice when the jury was in the room. We saw her almost be combative and argumentative with the judge. So it was truly a spectacle to see, and I think that's why there's so much attention here on this case. But again, we are at that guilty verdict, and you may have heard Kay Woodcock, again, Charles Vallow's sister, mention Brandon is next. She's referring to Brandon Boudreau, who is the alleged victim in another murder conspiracy case Lori Vallow Daybell is facing here in Arizona. That case is out of Gilbert, and she's set to go to trial in that case in just the next few weeks here. So certainly more to come, but certainly a day of victory and a day of justice for all the victims in this case so far. Mark, Caribe.
Erica, you mentioned that Vallow represented herself, and I think that kind of speaks to her ego, her lack of humility, her lack of remorse in her mannerisms out there. Did any of the people that you talked to react to the fact or say that, you know, they felt that she was pompous and was out without remorse?
You know, Mark, I think definitely that's a thought because, of course, she, you know, Kay Woodcock, I'm going back to her remarks outside the courtroom this afternoon. She said, she's almost like an actress. And I mentioned it a little bit ago. We almost saw different versions of her when she was in the courtroom. And, you know, I think that's important because, as I said, the jury was not picking up what she was selling. She claimed this was self-defense and ultimately got a guilty verdict in deliberating less, or roughly about 3 hours. So it was pretty quickly, too. So that speaks to the prosecution's case. And of course, there's one more to go here. Mark?
Yeah, I think in these cases we're most curious about how the jurors were receiving all of this testimony in Lori Vallow. So we're going to get to that. Erica, thank you. We want to go out now to 12 News journalist Bianca Bono, who was able to speak to some of those jurors after the verdict was read. What did they have to say, Bianca?
Yeah, I think part of what made this case so unusual is the fact that we had those horrific prior convictions. We're talking about a person who was convicted of murdering her 2 children, yet this case was completely separate. So those details were not brought up during the trial. So many people have wondered, did the jury know? Well, based on my interviews with 3 of them just minutes after that verdict came down, they did not. Take a listen.
Overall, how would you describe this experience, just in general, being a juror on a high-profile case?
Insane. Considering I only moved here 2 years ago, I never thought I'd be on a jury, let alone one of the biggest cases. So it basically seemed like she had no remorse.
It was sad, as he said. For me, it was the text messages that did it, as far as evidence. And I feel like we uncovered some lies.
Knowing now that she was convicted of killing her 2 children in Idaho.
I haven't had a chance to Google everything. I'm sure as soon as we get on the shuttle. So might have more to say later.
Was that difficult, going through this and not being able to be disconnected?
Yeah. It just felt like there was a lot of information that didn't make sense and that was missing.
You know, honestly, up until yesterday, I would have said not guilty. But when the prosecutor, I don't know, what do they call that? When they give their
closing argument.
Yeah. Yes, the closing argument. That's really, there's a few things she said in there, and then when I looked them up today, I was like, oh yeah, that's bad.
And another very interesting detail we gleaned from talking to those jurors. When deliberations began, there were a couple of jurors who believed Lori Vallow Daybell was not guilty, but they said it was a room full of adults. They were able to talk things out, work things out, and ultimately, of course, they ended up with that guilty verdict. Guys?